Mm-hmm. Excellent. Great. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good lunchtime. I think a few folks are still coming in, but let's dive straight in. I'm sure a few folks will join as we go. I'm Ben Werther, founder and CEO of Platfora. Very excited to be here to talk to you today about the Enterprise Data Reservoir, the journey we see many enterprises taking, kind of sharing some of the best practices from our customers, prospects, and sort of the experience we've had in the marketplace. And really less about the technology at a detail level, but really about how people are approaching this, sort of understanding the journey from maybe a traditional way of approaching data to kind of what is sort of we see the leading companies out there doing today. And we're going to take I wanted to just talk about some of the very specific learnings, but I wanted to kind of generalize it a little bit. And so I'm going to take the context of a bank. It's a bank we call Acorn Bank here. These acorns get deposited nicely into the tree. There's a number of different trees. You could call them silos of acorns. And we'll talk a little bit about the journey of Econ Bank from where it starts today, which is, would you believe, data warehouses, traditional ETL, business intelligence. The challenge of it, so I spent a number of years at Greenplum living through the traditional data warehouse approach to this kind of work. And the challenge is, so you have all these different silos of databases that have developed over time, hundreds, maybe thousands of different systems, thousands of different ETL jobs moving data between these systems. And so when this humble bird wants to kind of understand what's going on across the business, the challenge is no one system has that data. You try to build the enterprise data warehouse to rule them all, move data into that, and then the challenges or the barriers of trying to come up sort of unify all the data across the bank, the processes, the politics mean that you never really get there. And so what you tend to see, and we see it consistently, is a bank may have different departments, each have their unique view of data, and as they want to start asking questions, for example, about lifetime value of a customer or understanding risk and how that connects to maybe website behavior or things that really go outside of any one of those silos, they can't. They can't without spinning up a whole new system, reintegrating data at a new level into that system, and really sort of building from the ground up a new infrastructure for each particular question. It really starts with this idea that the old way of approaching data warehousing was all about building systems for a set of questions that I knew ahead of time. And the world we're in now is one where it's about answering the unanticipated questions and being able to collect all of this interesting data and be ready for doing that. So we're going to talk about how this bank shapes up, gets ready to answer these questions that can't be answered today. I want to give you a real specific example around this. So one of the banks that we work with is really struggling to think about sort of 360-degree view of a customer, and they have behavior on a website, they have behavior on mobile devices, they have transactions, they have risk analysis, they have retail banking. What you'd love to be able to do is say, I found this interesting segment of people who have behaved a certain way in my website. They spend a lot of time looking at these products. How do they interact differently with my services? How do they actually bank differently? But to do that is really, really difficult. There are different silos. There are questions that involve not just SQL type questions, but links to systems like Omniture and other types of databases. And they really cannot be answered in that in any sort of easy way, particularly by a business analyst trying to approach this from the ground up. So let's talk about how do we get from here to a path of competitiveness. And this is a journey that some of the big banks we work with, we've seen over the last 18 months that transition happen. Some are still on the journey, but many of them are sort of getting down that road. 10 steps to get there. 10 steps to get to from the sort of the old world to the new. Step one, physically consolidate raw data. This may not be controversial at all for this audience, but it actually is a controversial topic in a lot of places. What we see again and again is companies start working with Hadoop because they have this siloed sort of view of the world. So then they put all these new classes of data, event data, clickstream, and so on, into the data warehouse. And the idea is that they're going to sort of churn through that data and bring the interesting sort of nuggets of insight into the data warehouse for further analysis. But an effect of that is you don't have all the data in one system. You have transactional data sitting in your data warehouse. You have all this new data in this other system. And if you want to ask a question that spans it all, you simply cannot do that. And so you're back in siloed world again. The other thing we often hear is people say, well, I can use federation tools. I can really ask questions that will, from my desktop, I'll spiral out to all these different databases and bring things together. And it's true, you can at one level if you're asking pretty surface level questions. If I want to look at sales versus cost of marketing by zip code, I can do that on the desktop pretty easily. If I want to look at clickstream behavior by individual and look at how that converts based on clickstream behavior, and then sort of value that customer and the interaction they have through my banking experience, and do some dynamic segmentation based on that. I'm connecting large data sets together that might be multi-petabyte as part of my question. So the idea that I'm going to be able to just do this on the fly on my desktop, or do this through some federated query mechanism is really misguided. So I think the number one going in assumption here is you've got to get the data together into one big reservoir, one big lake that and data from across the business. And the magic of this is, unlike the old enterprise data warehouse where you had to sit in a room for a year and debate what the definition of a customer was, and all the different modeling and architecture things, you can physically consolidate raw data without any decisions up front. You just put the data in there. Files, that's it. Just put the files in there, stream data in there, and then let the value emerge over time, and we'll talk about how we get there through the next few steps. With this is eliminate friction. So I've seen a lot of companies that say, okay, we buy into this philosophy, and now we want to start putting data in there, but there's this team over here, and their data, they want to control it because they don't want people using it in the wrong way, and over here there's data that we don't think it's clean enough yet to put in there, and there's all these different friction points of people and policies. And I think it takes a brave organization, but a sort of a forward-looking one, to say, look, we want to make this silo, this reservoir, embrace all the data, whatever form it's in, whatever level of quality, whatever level of noise, whatever it is. Let's add metadata to understand what that data is and how we should use it. But if you put up any barrier to really letting data in there, any hurdle you have to pass through before you can put data in, people won't. You'll end up with data somewhere else. And so the idea of saying, well, the first mandate is no friction to get the data in, and just try to build this sort of unified pool of everything. And it's harder than it sounds. It takes a real commitment to avoid process and avoid hurdles. And we see people starting to do this, but it's a journey. And then the third is embrace an open foundation. And this is the magic of what we've been talking about this morning around HDFS and then Yarn and Hadoop 2, and the idea that before I had to make a vendor decision about where I was going to put my data, and that's a hard thing to do, and no, there's not going to be a one common set of decisions around an organization. But now, the magic of HDFS is it's a foundation where I can put this raw data. I don't have to care about the format of the data. I don't have to unify it up front. I don't have to make any vendor decision. I can put it in there, and then layer all kinds of different tools and frameworks that are going to emerge over the coming months and years on top of that to do different types of analysis. So in a sense, I'm future-proofing the data by putting it in there because it's not closed to any type of analysis that may come down the road. And I think that's more fundamental and more profound a change than I think many people have sort of considered, because you no longer have to re-platform data when you want to start asking a different set of questions or do a different class of analysis, and that's That's one that I know I'm very, very excited about. And the new kinds of things that are going to merge on top of that will allow analysis will surprise you. We're seeing some of them, we're building some of them ourselves, but I think as a collective community, the interactive tools, the types of different deep analytical tools, there's going to be this is where all the sort of fertile ground is over the coming few years. So next step, I've got my data in there. Now what? And part of this was, okay, we're not going to make any decisions up front about what we want to, about the meaning of the data or any committees or anything ahead of time. I'm just going to land the data in there. So now that it's in there, how do I avoid this becoming, I sometimes think about that scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark where there's at the end, there's the warehouse of boxes and there's all this data in there and nobody knows what any of it is and it's just huge amounts of volumes of space. And adding in metadata, adding in richness and meaning to this data becomes very important. And so forget about, there's a debate about schema on read versus schema on write. I think that's all, at some level, hard extremes that don't make sense. You've got to land data before you know how you're going to use it, but you've got to add in the metadata iteratively so that when downstream, as other users come by and they want to start looking at these data sets and using them together, they can actually understand what's there. And so that can come in different forms. Things like age catalog help. We actually at Platfora do some things around helping people not just build sort of a metadata view into all the underlying data sets, but also start to enrich it with calculated fields and join relationships and kind of common measures and business meaning that you can start to use as you want to start using these data sets in different ways. So you don't just have raw data, you now have something which is usable information that you can start to weave together in different ways downstream. But I think that the bottom line is adding in the meaning progressively is the only way to do it. It can never be done in a big bang fashion successfully because things change too quickly. Metadata is one thing. The next is how do you connect these data sets together? And again, if you say up front, I'm going to try to build the one unified data model to rule them all, you'll spend a year and a half doing that, and at the end of it, you will have to start again because it'll be obsolete. This is a well-known story. So how do you do this iteratively? And I think that one of the big shifts we're seeing is this sort of pivot of perspective from kind of fact-centric. So the traditional model, you had the idea of fact tables and star and snowflake schema, and these fact tables that were all the different events like clicks or impressions or purchases, and then dimensions, people, devices, time, all the things that were kind of attributes of these different records. And that's one way of looking at the world, and it's the way you traditionally model in a database. What we're seeing is this shift towards kind of dimension or entity-centric views of the world. So instead of looking at it that way, maybe I want to look at it as I have customers. And I have customers, and those customers interact with my business in a whole lot of different ways. They became a customer, that was a life cycle event. There's website interaction, there's purchase behavior, there's social graph relationships that were established potentially. There's all these different things that weave people together, and if you look at it from the perspective of a person rather than from a fact table, you can actually ask much more interesting questions about sort of behavior over time and sort of the attributes and characteristics of people. And so I think we see this evolution where the tools to do that are still pretty primitive, but increasingly that's going to make it much more meaningful to look at to be able to just add new data sets. If I learn something new about customers, if I have a new part of my business that's doing something around, let's say, mobile transactions, and I have this data being generated, being able to just connect that in and say, this is linked by user, a customer, and now it's part of this picture, and I can start to incorporate it into the questions I ask. That's a very powerful thing versus I've got to go remodel my whole database and try to figure out how to do conforming dimensions and integration and the rest of it. So again, something we think about a lot, something that I know people are doing in custom development today, and they're doing as they think about sort of data science type problems, but this isn't something that's percolated its way into sort of BI and sort of the analytical tools yet for the most part. One of the things that we've seen again and again kind of hold up these sort of data reservoir projects. So there's a number of companies we've worked with that they get going, they're very excited about the prospect of doing this, and then at some point somebody says, hang on, all this data, you can't just throw all that data together in the same system. There are governance rules, we have compliance, there's PII data. How are you going to do this and respect the business requirements here? And I think what we've seen is that taking this seriously from the get-go is an essential part of this. It's one thing if you're a Facebook and the intention is that everybody can look at almost all the data, but if you have more demands on that, you have to make a case from the get-go that says, look, putting all the data in here and then layering security on top of it, we've allowed ourselves to build this unified pool and then have controls that respect the different boundaries. But if I want to change if I want to ask a question where we decided that it's important that I can connect these different data sets together, maybe at some aggregate grain of detail so it's anonymized, that we can do that as a policy decision and not a year-long project, and make that very, very clean. The other nuance in this is, so HDFS has access control permissions tied to Kerberos and the rest, but we're just at the beginning of this journey, and so when you think about, in the traditional database world, you had databases that had permissions, then you had app servers and all these other user identities that probably didn't have accounts at the database level. I think we're running into the same kind of thing here, where consider an in-memory application that's going to be distilling and organizing raw data from Hadoop and then driving capabilities above that. So let's say all the stuff we talked about this morning around Yarn and new classes of applications. Well, each one of those applications is sort of distilling data on behalf of somebody and presenting it to some set of users. So in the same way that the app servers kind of messed with the security model, what's the security model that says who can actually access that in-memory thing, and how do you tie that back to HDFS, or is there a new kind of higher-level abstraction that you run into that we have to build out as a community that lets you understand what you should be able to access wherever it lives in this sort of stack of different types of engines and processing, and something so we've done a lot of work around this. For some of our clients around at Platforma, around both reflecting sort of understanding and respecting HDFS type access control, but also how do you set access control at the level so you understand lineage and what people should see when they're looking at visualization, so that if they can't see underlying data sets, they shouldn't be able to see things upstream unless there's a policy change to allow that. But it's something that actually comes up and has blocked a lot of projects we've seen. So it's one that I would encourage you guys to think carefully about if you're sort of embarking on this journey. Okay, let's get to the exciting part of this. Now I've got data in there. I've now got sort of enough of a framework of how this all weaves together that now I've got business users coming along and saying, well, I want to do something against this data. The classic thing we see is there'll be often one or two angry business users who they know that there's some really interesting data in that Hadoop cluster that's not in the data warehouse, and they're trying to figure out how to go use that to solve some problem they have. And the classic challenge, as we've seen again and again, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with, is either you end up building a data mart outside of Hadoop, and you manually do all that ETL work and pull data out, and you build them this sort of little silo so they can use their Tableaus and Spotfires and the rest. You go do that though, and that's a long, painful process. You basically built back all that inflexibility that you were trying to get rid of in the first place. You can point them at it directly and expect them to sort of fend for themselves, and now you're expecting them to all know how to do sort of low-level Hadoop access, which is not ideal. Or the emerging SQL interfaces are good, and I think they're helpful, but they don't eliminate the need for all that. Deciding on the data model, what am I going to aggregate, which tables should I access, a lot of just sort of complexity that can easily end up overwhelming end users. And I think that this is one where, obviously at Platforma, if you guys know what we do, this is something we're very passionate about, but I think that we're only scratching the surface of what's necessary here to make Hadoop useful. And, collectively, an anecdote of there was a large financial services company on the East Coast that we met with, where they'd gone and done this whole Hadoop bake-off, and they were ready to go, and then they went to the business users and said, okay, we're ready to get going, go to town. And the business users said, well, what do we do? And they said, well, go take a training class, go learn about Hadoop, and you'll figure out how to use this stuff. And that was the end of the project. So the idea that that people can just figure this stuff out is just flat out wrong. And so there's a lot of technologies that you can start to weave together, but fundamentally making a great experience that's easy and interactive and familiar and collaborative is, it's as much work as building Hadoop itself in many ways. So I think this is a very, very important part of this. The other part, which I think is increasingly overlooked, is you actually want to ask different questions of the kinds of data that go into Hadoop. It's not just about, okay, I've got my traditional BI product and now I want to run it against data in Hadoop. You have log records, clickstream data, graph, social graph data, tweets, all kinds of different classes of data that don't lend themselves to just being sort of sliced and diced in traditional BI fashion. So you start want to ask questions that are over time and space and involve patterns and relationships. And I think that more and more, I think that notion that the kind of questions are different, and that's going to drive a new class of tools and capabilities, and that the old BI guys are going to live in this sort of legacy corner, I think is something we see very clearly. I think we're sort of seeing this notion emerging more and more as people get their hands dirtier with this stuff. But I think that looking for the tools and capabilities that will let you answer questions, the questions you want to answer on the kinds of data that are in Hadoop, leads you down a very different road than just how do I take my traditional SQL style, relational data and go from there. The last one is, how do you scale this up to enterprise demands? And I think this is something that, as Acorn Bank, as a proxy for a big, so let's say a big New York bank, I've gone and built this data reservoir. I put data in it. I've figured out how I'm going to now empower my users, and now I have 10,000 users that come in the morning and they want to go use something that's going to tap into that system. So I think we're all very excited about the evolution of the core stack here from a Hadoop standpoint. But if you look at the traditional database world, we built caches, we built other things that were about accelerating and offloading and removing the need to go rescan raw data every time I asked a question. I think what we're going to see here is that once everybody gets comfortable with the fact that yes, we can actually start to ask meaningful questions against Hadoop in an easier way. You throw thousands of people doing that at a system and you realize, okay, that doesn't work anymore. I need to figure out ways to have in-memory caching. I need to have ways that remove the need to go back and just rescan the same blocks on HDFS again and again and again and again, distill aggregates and so on. So, I think the kind of architectures we're seeing people think about are more like using the data reservoir as this hub and building out these sort of application-specific spokes that sort of accelerate different views onto that data that then can drive interaction and much more useful application behavior, but without having to make everything go back and hit the core reservoir. The reservoir becomes the central point of truth, the central point of all the data, the place you can iteratively drive more and more views as your needs change, but it's not just it's not the place every question has to go, because that doesn't scale. And I think that's something we're seeing the bleeding edge of folks run into now as they think about scaling up. And so this is again something that there's not a lot of good infrastructure for yet, but I think is going to be a bigger and bigger story. And it's an interesting question in the context of Yarn and Hadoop 2 and the rest. How do you elastically scale the interaction layer independently of the core batch processing layer? How do these things work together and coexist and interplay off each other so that you're able to have many, many different applications or views into that data that are high performance, can scale with a business, and yet not necessarily force you to build a massive Hadoop cluster that where you're sizing it based on some sort of attempt to match the interaction load. You're really, focus on the batch cycle and the interactive cycle as two separate but kind of coupled loops, and not try to boil the ocean with one approach. And then I think the last lesson here, I think, again and again, I often get the question, okay, what happens after Hadoop? What happens after I go down this journey and I get to a point where I realize that all the stuff we've just adopted is now obsolete, or I there's a whole lot of different technologies here that are changing so fast. There's all these new different libraries and new different vendors and new different projects. How do I, isn't anything I do going to become obsolete? And I think that the thing that I often counsel people to think about is, look, there's a lot of technology evolution. Any disruption creates a whole lot of new and very exciting, but also very noisy things that happen at that point in time. But focus on what is the key shift here. And I think that if you look at what is the generational, that sort of 25, 30-year shift, is this something meaningful that has changed, or is this just new names for the old way of approaching working with data? And I strongly argue that there is a change, a rift in the way people are going to be able to work here that is fundamental. And it's about that shift that we've been talking about, from the idea of the enterprise data warehouse and figuring out all your questions ahead of time, to the idea of this pool that's going to sort of support raw data, iteratively building views based on different application or user needs, and then providing open different types of analysis and access against that. And that idea that I can answer the unanticipated questions, the data becomes raw material for what's to come, rather than I have to know ahead of time how I'm going to use it. That's a very, very fundamental shift. At some level, that's the main thing that matters here. That if you can build I will bet very, very confidently that, first of all, that whatever Hadoop will evolve into a whole lot of different things that will still be called Hadoop and will be an evolution of where we are today. But that the idea of this sort of data reservoir, or this sort of sense of I'm going to pull data first and then derive value from it incrementally, is going to endure beyond that, or is going to be concurrent with that. That there's no world in which that becomes less important, because that is the fundamental shift here. And so, we've gone through this journey. Let's consider where we've got to. As Acorn Bank, we started out, struggling with the shackles of data warehouses and, the pain of trying to answer questions in that world. And I want to share an anecdote about, the journey here, and I think why it's actually more transformative than people realize. So in going from that data warehouse approach to achieving the sort of data reservoir incremental approach, we can shed a lot of cost. There's no question that there's a cost reduction aspect of, I don't have to have these big expensive data warehouses, all the people doing manual data modeling, and all the sort of things that were sort of cumbersome before. I can be faster at deriving insights against that data. Instead of spending a year and a half trying to sort of debate how a new data set fits into the picture, I can literally just start using it the very next day. But I think the biggest thing for me is the, I'm staggered by the way companies have been sort of lulled into a sense of complacency around the way they do things today, and how it goes beyond that. So there's a company I was talking to at one point that they described their process. If they wanted to add one column all the way through their pipeline, through the ETL data warehousing, all the way through to their sort of reports at the other end, just one column, what would it take them to do that? And they started describing this sort of flows, and it boiled down to, it was somewhere between 12 and 18 months. 3 outsourced firms, they had monthly risk mitigation meetings, they planned this thing out, there was 10 or 15 people involved, and so what was the effect of that? Well, they didn't do that. They lived with the data model they had, and the data model they had wasn't even a very good one. It was based on something they'd acquired that wasn't even very well suited for their business. And so what was the effect of that? The effect was they were answering and driving questions and driving their business based on questions that were determined by what they could ask based on a data model that was not even relevant, and their business had changed. They couldn't actually ask any of the questions they really wanted to understand user behavior, value of customer, churn, any of that stuff. They were just, and so they were, it was too hard to ask the questions. And I think that the change here, the really exciting change for me, is we're going from a world where asking interesting questions is a 12, 18-month or impossible challenge, to one where those same questions become available to be answered today. And the ability for people to sort of learn new insights about the business, to iterate and to really find out more and be smarter and make smarter companies. I think that that's the untold value here that we're just at the beginning of. And I think that it's going to be a very, very exciting journey as we kind of progress down this path. And so I think what I will ask, I'm going to open up for questions in a second. If you want to hear a more slightly more grounded version of this sort of Acorn Bank analogy, we have a sponsor talk at 2 o'clock with some actual customers talking about what they are doing with Platform and how they see this journey from in a practical sense. But I think that I really love this. This period of time in the industry feels like such an interesting transformation. And I think that the companies that are doing this right have enormous competitive advantage relative to the old ways, which are going to look increasingly archaic and insane when you actually look back at what we had to put up with in the old days. So with that, let me open up any questions.
Good afternoon. Sure. So you talked in number 6 about compliance and security concerns, and sure. I'm curious if there are any, you might say, practical or tactical strategies that you have for either tagging or classifying data so that as you pour it into this single reservoir, it doesn't get distributed in a way you don't want, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we do it. So the question was really around sort of tagging and understanding, different data sets in the reservoir. The way we approach it, the first level you said HDFS permissions. So that's at the very broadest level. Who can access that path in the file in the Hadoop file system, and it's a very coarse-grained way of controlling it, but it's one that is actually fairly reasonable. So in the work that we do, we're building this stack we have a stack that is building accelerated sort of scale out of memory data marts that provide that you access through this front end exploratory BI model, and so there's a lot of different artifacts you want to think about security on. There's the data sources themselves. Which data source do I have the right to go browse, to be able to sort of incorporate into my sort of to build data sets against? There are data sets I create within that, and then there are actually high-level artifacts like the in-memory lenses, these sort of distilled data marts, and the actual visualization dashboards and visual elements. And so I think the way we think about it is lineage is really the key piece of the story. Being able to track automatically. One is, for every piece of thing I'm looking at on the screen, what data went into that, and what data do we know about as permission, both at an HDFS level or based on anything we've added above that, so that I can actually make a determination of what a user should be able to see. But then be able to reflect that up and down the stack. So it's not much fun to build a dashboard and have to go manually reconcile, well, based on this dashboard and what you're looking at, and your permissions at the HDFS level, like how do I reconcile what you should be able to see at that level of abstraction? If that's manual and you have to go set permissions at multiple levels, that gets incredibly hard. And so how can you make that kind of a streamlined process? And so we've done a fair amount of work around that that has sort of met requirements for some federal and financial services and other needs. So happy to talk about that offline. Cool.
I just had a quick question about the empowering end users.
Yeah.
Makes a ton of sense, and as you said, a lot of these SQL merging technologies are coming out, but I don't think they're necessarily quite there in terms of hooking up your Tableau and Spotfire. We've been internally looking at Redshift, as a possibility, but it still entails that nasty ETL out of our cluster. Just curious, what are some of your clients doing today, until this SQL technologies catch up? Yeah,
good question. So I think first of all, it's worth asking what is the end game of those SQL technologies. So we love that. The evolution of the stack and the fact that there are these sort of fast SQL interfaces in. And they're going to help with the use cases that are really around querying relatively small amounts of data in the overall scheme of things at higher performance. So if I want, if I'm writing a query that's going to hit a petabyte of raw disk, that's slow in Teradata. That's going to be even slower in Hadoop with these different layers. That in itself is not enough. So there's so recognizing that that a fast SQL interface is only a piece of the picture, and so you still have to do manual, data modeling, aggregation. You have to decide what data is important ahead of time. What we're seeing is that in conjunction with that, using those kind of technologies to sort of build these artifacts that are sort of more aggregated and smarter, we're actually providing this sort of in-memory layer that's optimized around really tightly optimized data that's for sub-second performance interactivity. But there's this closed loop where if I want to get more detail about a set of customers and add more grain, I don't have to go do a bunch of SQL to go change my data model and change my aggregations and do change a bunch of batch scripts and all of that. I can just click through and say, hey, I want to change this lens to incorporate this more detail and have it be part of have the ETL be driven by the BI experience effectively. And I think that's something that we believe very strongly in, that if you really want to make this accessible, you can't just say, I'm going to recreate the old data warehouse environment. That's not enough. You really need to think about how are you going to drive the whole experience all the way back to the raw data from the user's questions and changing needs. So.
Yeah, so what is the infrastructure, software and hardware infrastructure behind this data warehouse or a reservoir?
Yeah, so I mean, data reservoir is, this is fundamentally, and I should have been more explicit, this is about using Hadoop as that reservoir fundamentally, as a place to land the data. Hadoop is the foundation for doing all of this work, and HDFS and the things that layer on top of that. On top of that, then there are capabilities that help accelerate business value and time to value and the rest of it, the sort of things that we do. But I think that the fundamental here is the reason why we're all here, which is Hadoop and this emerging stack as the core of this new architecture. Good. Any other questions? Good. Well, thank you very much. Good to talk to you today. Actually.